Libya, July 1942. Four men in a single vehicle drive onto a German airfield at Sidi Hanish in the western desert at 2 o'clock in the morning. They are not in disguise. They are not moving cautiously. They are traveling at approximately 60 kilometers per hour with every weapon on the vehicle firing simultaneously. The vehicle is a Willys MB Jeep that has been modified so extensively that it no longer resembles the utility transport it was designed to be. It carries 8 machine guns. It carries approximately 4,000 rounds of ammunition. It weighs, fully loaded with fuel, water, explosives, and crew, somewhere in excess of 1,400 kilograms, nearly twice its rated payload capacity. It takes 11 minutes to traverse the length of the airfield. When it exits, 37 German aircraft are burning on the ground. Not one member of the crew is killed. The problem facing British irregular forces in the North African theater in 1941 and 1942 was a problem of proportion. The Axis powers maintained airfields distributed across a supply corridor stretching from Tripolitania east through Cyrenaica, from which the Luftwaffe and Regia Aeronautica conducted operations against Allied shipping, ground forces, and the strategically critical harbor at Malta. Conventional air interdiction of these facilities required aircraft that were themselves subject to attrition, fuel constraints, and the considerable difficulty of locating dispersed desert airfields from altitude. Bombing raids on hardened targets consumed resources disproportionate to their results. Many aircraft were revetted in dispersal bays that absorbed bomb damage without propagating it to adjacent aircraft. What was needed was a method of destroying aircraft on the ground at a rate and scale that conventional bombing could not reliably achieve, at a cost in men and materiel that the broader strategic situation could sustain. The answer was not delivered from the air. It was driven across the desert floor in a vehicle originally designed to carry a radio operator and a staff officer between headquarters buildings. The Special Air Service had been founded by Lieutenant Colonel David Sterling in 1941 on a specific operational premise: that small parties of trained men inserted behind enemy lines by parachute or overland approach could destroy more aircraft on the ground than a conventional bombing squadron could destroy in the air. The early parachute operations of late 1941 produced mixed results, largely due to navigational difficulties and the dependence on the long-range desert group for extraction. The transition to vehicle-mounted raiding in early 1942 changed the operational calculus entirely, and it changed it primarily because of what could be done to a standard Jeep with sufficient mechanical ingenuity and no institutional constraints on payload specifications. The Willys MB Jeep in its standard configuration weighed approximately 1,040 kilograms fully fueled and carried a rated payload of 270 kilograms. Its wheelbase of 2 meters and ground clearance of 22 centimeters made it navigable across the broken gravel surfaces of the Libyan desert at speeds that larger vehicles could not sustain. The SAS modification program, conducted at base workshops in Kabrit and later at forward positions, stripped the vehicle of every component that did not contribute to range, firepower, or crew survival. Windscreens were removed entirely. Glass reflecting moonlight was a navigational hazard and a visibility liability simultaneously. Doors were absent as standard. Front bumpers were retained only where they provided mounting points for additional equipment. The weight saved through stripping was immediately reapplied in the form of armament and ammunition that exceeded the vehicle's rated capacity by a margin that British Army ordnance officers, had they been consulted, would not have sanctioned. The primary armament configuration that evolved through operational experience by mid-1942 consisted of twin Vickers K machine guns mounted on a rear pintle and a single or twin Vickers K on a forward mount accessible to the front passenger. The Vickers K, designated the Vickers Gas-Operated or VGO in its ground role, was an aircraft observer's weapon adapted for vehicle use. It fired .303 caliber ammunition from a 100-round Pan magazine at a cyclic rate of approximately 950 rounds per minute. Twin rear-mounted guns, therefore, delivered a combined cyclic rate of approximately 1,900 rounds per minute. A four-jeep patrol, the standard SAS rating element by the summer of 1942, carried 8 Vickers K weapons firing simultaneously, producing a combined output of approximately 7,600 rounds per minute across a frontage determined by the spacing between vehicles. Against unarmored aircraft parked in the open, this volume of incendiary and armor-piercing tracer fire was not a suppression tool, it was a destruction mechanism. An aircraft fuselage exposed to 2 seconds of sustained Vickers K fire at close range received sufficient incendiary projectile strikes to ignite its fuel system in a substantial majority of cases. The operational record of the Jeep raids in the Western Desert between March and November 1942 constitutes the most extensively documented case study in vehicle-mounted airfield interdiction in the Second World War. The raid on Sidi Hanish on the night of 26th to 27th July 1942 involved 18 jeeps operating in 2 parallel columns under the command of Major Sterling. The vehicles entered the airfield perimeter by driving through the boundary wire at speed and proceeded down the length of the runway, firing all weapons into the dispersal areas on both sides. Post-raid assessment, conducted by aerial reconnaissance the following morning and subsequently corroborated by Luftwaffe administrative records recovered after the war, confirmed the destruction of 37 aircraft, the majority of which were Junkers U-52 transport aircraft. The entire engagement lasted under 15 minutes. SAS casualty returns for the operation listed 2 men wounded and 0 killed. The aircraft destroyed at Sidi Hanish in a single night represented a greater loss than the Luftwaffe's transport fleet in the theater had sustained from all other causes in the preceding month. The Benghazi airfield complex was raided 3 times between June and September 1942, with documented aircraft losses across those operations totaling in excess of 40 machines. Berka Satellite Airfield was struck in June 1942 with losses of 15 aircraft confirmed. The cumulative total of aircraft destroyed or permanently disabled by SAS Jeep operations across the North African campaign has been assessed at over 250. However, precise figures remain contested due to incomplete Axis administrative records from the period. The comparative context for vehicle-mounted raiding reveals that no other force in the Second World War deployed a weapons platform of equivalent capability-to-cost ratio against fixed air assets. The German Brandenburger units and the Italian Decima Mas conducted sabotage operations behind Allied lines, but neither employed vehicle-mounted direct action raids against airfields at scale. The American Office of Strategic Services was inserting agents and conducting sabotage operations across occupied Europe during the same period, but OSS doctrine prioritized infrastructure demolition over direct assault. The Long Range Desert Group, which provided navigation and transport support to early SAS operations, carried weaponry primarily for self-protection rather than offensive employment. The Jeep raid was a British operational invention with no direct equivalent in any contemporary forces doctrine, and it remained without institutional successors in conventional military planning for the duration of the campaign. The limitations were mechanical and logistical in approximately equal measure. The overloaded Jeep sustained accelerated wear to its suspension, transmission, and tires at a rate that standard maintenance schedules could not address under desert operating conditions. A vehicle carrying 1,400 kilograms across a corrugated desert surface experienced spring and shock absorber failure at intervals measured in hundreds rather than thousands of kilometers. Tire failures on the approach to a target, which occurred with documented frequency in SAS operational logs, required the entire patrol to halt in exposed terrain for intervals of between 15 and 30 minutes. The fuel consumption of a heavily laden Jeep operating at speed across desert terrain substantially exceeded factory specifications, reducing the operational radius from the theoretical maximum of approximately 450 kilometers to a practical figure often closer to 300, which constrained the depth of targets accessible without forward fuel caches established by separate logistics elements. The Vickers K guns, though reliable under most conditions, were sensitive to the fine sand characteristic of the Libyan coastal desert, and stoppages during engagements were recorded in a proportion of raid reports sufficient to indicate a systemic rather than incidental problem. The deeper limitation was strategic rather than mechanical. The Jeep raids succeeded in part because German airfield security in the Western Desert in 1941 and 1942 was predicated on the assumption that the desert itself constituted an impassable barrier to vehicle penetration from the south and west. Once this assumption was revised, as it was incrementally through the summer and autumn of 1942, perimeter defenses deepened, alert states increased, and the window of approach that had allowed 18 vehicles to drive onto an active airfield and exit without catastrophic loss began to close. The last major Jeep raid of the North African campaign, conducted in November 1942, encountered perimeter response times that had decreased from the 20 to 30 minutes characteristic of 1942 engagements to under 5 minutes. The operational environment that had made the overloaded Jeep the most cost-effective offensive weapon in the theater had a lifespan measured in months. The total cost of the SAS North African Jeep Raid program in vehicles, fuel, ammunition, and personnel losses has never been precisely calculated by any official assessment. The total value of aircraft destroyed in those operations, calculated at Luftwaffe procurement cost per airframe in 1942 Reichsmarks, has. The ratio between the two figures is not recorded in any single document. The men who could have provided it were already somewhere else in the desert by the time anyone thought to ask.